You probably think of yourself as being nothing like a chicken. You do not have feathers. You do not peck at the ground for seeds. Most importantly, you were born, not hatched. But if you look back at your family tree, you will find that for the vast majority of history, your ancestors came in shells. Laying eggs is the standard way to have a baby on this planet. It is efficient, it is safe, and it worked for over 300 million years. Then, for some reason, your specific lineage decided to throw the whole system away. You traded a hard, protective shell for a dangerous, months-long internal pregnancy that drains your energy and puts your life at risk. It sounds like a terrible deal on the surface. Why carry a heavy, energy-draining baby inside you for months when you could just leave it in a nest? Here's why we made that choice anyway. The egg is one of the greatest inventions in the history of life. Before it existed, our ancestors were tied to the water. Life on Earth began nearly 3.9 billion years ago as tiny single-celled organisms. For billions of years, life stayed in the oceans. Even after the first animals appeared 665 million years ago, they were essentially stuck in the water. If they wanted to reproduce, they had to lay soft, jelly-like eggs in ponds or streams. If those eggs dried out, the babies died. This kept life huddled near the shore for hundreds of millions of years. Then, about 340 million years ago, a group of animals called amniotes changed everything. They developed an egg equipped with an amnion, which is a protective membrane that keeps the embryo moist even on dry land. This was the ultimate survival kit. It allowed our ancestors to march into the heart of continents and live in places where water was scarce. For a long time, this was the peak of biological technology. Even when our specific branch, the synapsids, split off about 318 million years ago, we kept laying eggs. We were essentially reptile-like creatures with scales and a cold-blooded lifestyle. If you saw your ancestor 300 million years ago, you would call it a lizard. You would never guess that its descendants would one day build cities and fly to the moon. So why did we stop? The problem started when the world became a much more dangerous place. During the age of the dinosaurs, our ancestors were forced into the shadows to survive. Early mammals were tiny, shrew-like creatures that lived in constant fear. They were small enough to fit in the palm of your hand, and they were surrounded by massive predators that ruled the daylight. To survive, we became nocturnal. We lived our lives in the dark, and this changed our biology forever. When you live in the cold night, you cannot rely on the sun to keep you warm. You have to generate your own heat. This is the period when our ancestors became warm-blooded. This created a massive problem for egg laying. Eggs are extremely sensitive to temperature. If an egg gets too cold, the embryo inside dies. If a mother has to leave her eggs to hunt in the freezing night, she is taking a massive risk. Every time she leaves the nest, she could return to find a nest of dead babies. At the same time, we were developing another strange new habit. We were growing hair and producing milk. In the beginning, milk was likely just a way to keep eggs moist or provide a small amount of nutrients to hatchlings, but it eventually became an evolutionary revolution. Once we could feed our babies from our own bodies, the internal contents of the egg became less important. We did not need to pack every single nutrient a baby would ever need into a yolk and a shell. We could provide those nutrients on the go through milk. This brings us to the most famous weirdo in the animal kingdom, the platypus. It's a living fossil that shows us exactly what this transition looked like. Platypuses are mammals, but they still lay eggs. Their genome shows that they have sex genes that are actually closer to birds than to you. They represent the middle ground. They prove that you do not need to choose between being a mammal and laying eggs. You can do both. But our ancestors decided that doing both was not good enough for survival. The real split happened about 160 million years ago, when a group called the Therians appeared. These were the first animals in our line to give up the egg and give birth to live young. In the beginning, this was not the sophisticated process we see today. Early Therians likely had pouches for keeping their undeveloped young, much like modern marsupials. The baby was born extremely early and had to crawl into a pouch to finish growing. It was a step up from an egg because the mother could keep the baby warm and protected at all times, but it was still limited. Then, about 125 million years ago, the Eutherians appeared. This was the birth of the placental mammals. This group developed a specialized organ called a placenta that allowed the mother and the baby to share a blood supply. The placenta was a biological breakthrough because it allowed the baby to stay inside the mother for much longer. This meant the baby could grow larger, stronger, and more complex before it ever faced the dangers of the outside world. You have to understand how much this changed the game. Female placental mammals do not have pouches, and they do not have the extra bones needed to support them. Instead, they have a placenta that penetrates the walls of the uterus. This creates a high-speed connection for nutrients. It also meant that the mother and father needed a new way to determine the sex of their babies. In egg-laying ancestors, sex was often determined by the environment, but in Therians, it became controlled by a specific gene called the SRY gene on the Y chromosome. This made the process more predictable and stable inside the mother's body. We also saw a massive shift in our anatomy. Our ancestors developed separate openings for waste and reproduction, moving away from the single opening or cloaca that birds and reptiles still have today. We were becoming more specialized and more efficient. This leads us to the most important question. Why go through all that trouble? Why risk the mother's life with a long, exhausting pregnancy? The answer is your brain. Large, complex brains require an incredible amount of energy to grow. They also take a long time to develop. An egg has a fixed amount of space and a fixed amount of fuel in the form of a yolk. You can only grow a brain so large inside a shell before you run out of room or energy. But with a placenta, the fuel is essentially unlimited. The mother can constantly pump nutrients and oxygen from her own blood into the growing baby. This allowed our ancestors to break the biological ceiling of intelligence. It is no coincidence that the animals with the largest brains on the planet are almost all placental mammals. We traded the safety of the egg for the power of the mind. The period between 2 million years ago and 800,000 years ago saw a massive expansion of the human brain. This was driven by the need to communicate and hunt prey efficiently in a fluctuating environment. We needed to be smart to survive, and we could only be smart because we carried our babies inside us. Cooking food eventually gave us even more energy, but the foundation was laid millions of years earlier when we decided to stop laying eggs. We became the smartest creatures on Earth because we were willing to be the most vulnerable mothers. This trade-off defines who you are today. Humans have one of the longest and most difficult pregnancies in the animal kingdom because our babies have such massive heads. We have reached the absolute limit of what is physically possible. If our brains were any larger at birth, we could not be born at all. So, the next time you think about how difficult human pregnancy is, remember that it is the reason you can think, speak, and understand the words I am saying right now. You are the product of 125 million-year-old biological gamble that paid off in the form of human consciousness. We stopped laying eggs so we could start thinking.
We traded the shell for the spirit. It makes you wonder what other ancient habits are still controlling our lives today without us even realizing it. If we gained our brains from the womb, what did we gain from the way we move? Like, why did we suddenly decide to stand up and start walking on two legs? It changed the shape of our hips and made childbirth even more difficult, so there must have been a massive benefit. Click here to find out why your ancestors abandoned the trees and how it changed the shape of your feet forever.